They smashed a bottle over my head in front of 100 guests. I walked out bleeding and called my lawyer. 3 weeks later, I came back with the deed to their house and a smile they'll remember forever. The champagne bottle exploded across my skull, raining crimson and glass onto the pristine marble floor. And in that deafening silence, I realized my own family had just tried to bury me. But what they didn't know was that 3 weeks later, I'd walk back in with the deed to their house, and a smile they'd never ever forget. My name is Callum Hayes and I'm 48. That night at my brother Morgan's 50th birthday party, I learned exactly what family loyalty was worth. The silver pocket watch in my jacket ticked steadily as I staggered out, blood trailing in my wake. The chandeliers glittered with a harsh brilliance above the polished marble floors of the Highland Village estate. Guests draped in designer suits and glittering dresses floated from room to room, champagne glasses balanced effortlessly in manicured hands. The air smelled of cedarwood and money, an aroma that had been part of my life since I could remember. It was Morgan's 50th, and if you didn't know better, you'd think it was a senator's inauguration. I stepped inside, smoothing the lapels of my navy suit, the one I reserved for weddings and funerals. I was greeted with polite nods and forced smiles, the kind people use when they're obligated to acknowledge you but would rather not. It was always like this, like I was a distant relative, someone necessary but not quite welcome. Morgan was the center of it all, standing beneath the archway with a whiskey glass in one hand and his other arm around Vivian. They were laughing with a group of associates I didn't recognize, probably from one of his recent business acquisitions. His suit was custom-tailored, sharp lines and perfect creases that spoke of appointments I'd never been invited to. When his eyes caught mine, he lifted his glass slightly, more in acknowledgement than greeting. I nodded back, making my way to the bar. Iris was there, draped in a crimson dress that sparkled under the lights. Her hair was pulled back in a bun so tight I wondered if it hurt. She was speaking with a tall man in a charcoal suit, her fingers brushing his arm as she laughed. When she saw me, her smile faltered just enough for me to notice. "Callum," she said, stretching her lips into something that resembled a smile. "I wasn't sure you'd make it." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, taking a glass of champagne from the bar. The bartender didn't ask if I wanted it, just handed it to me like it was assumed I'd follow the script. "Well, I'm glad you're here," she said, her eyes glancing past me almost immediately. "Morgan's been waiting to speak with you." I turned slightly, following her gaze. Morgan had separated from his circle and was making his way over, whiskey still in hand. His smile was broader now, dripping with confidence. "Little brother," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder a bit too hard. "Glad you could join us." "Wouldn't miss it," I echoed, forcing a grin. He looked me over, eyes pausing on the cuffs of my suit. I knew what he saw. 3 years out of style, a little too tight around the shoulders. His lips twitched, but he didn't comment. "Let's get a drink," he suggested, steering me away from the crowd. We walked through the hall, polished marble floors clicking under our shoes. Paintings of stern-faced ancestors watched us from the walls, their frames gilded and heavy. We passed by the study, its doors closed but leaking light from beneath. Laughter spilled out from somewhere down the hall, mingling with the clink of glasses. Morgan led me to a side room, smaller and more intimate, with leather chairs and a wooden bar. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon, sliding one across the counter to me. "To family," he said, raising his glass. "To family," I replied, clinking mine against his. The bourbon burned on the way down, but I didn't flinch. He leaned back against the bar, swirling his glass thoughtfully. "You know, I was talking to Mom the other day," he began, eyes fixed on the amber liquid. "We were discussing legacy, future, all that." I raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" He nodded, eyes still trained on his drink. "Yeah, and she brought up something interesting. Your place. Midtown." My grip tightened slightly around the glass. I took another sip, waiting. "She thinks it would make sense for me to take it over," he continued casually. "You know, consolidate the family assets. It's just sitting there, really." I set my glass down a bit harder than intended. "It's not just sitting there. I live in it." He smiled, the kind of smile that's meant to be disarming but only succeeds in irritating. "Sure, for now. But I'm expanding, Callum. I need a place closer to the projects I'm running. It's practical." I let out a breath through my nose, slow and controlled. "Practical for you, maybe?" Morgan's eyes flashed for a moment before he collected himself. He straightened his jacket and set his glass aside. "Look, it's not just me. Mom thinks it's a good idea too. She wants to talk to you about it." "Of course she does." As if on cue, Iris appeared in the doorway, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Boys," she cooed, stepping in and closing the door behind her. "Are we all having a good chat?" Morgan flashed her a grin. "Just getting to the good part." Iris turned her gaze to me, and I could see the calculation in her eyes. "Callum," she started, taking a step forward. "We were just discussing the condo. It makes sense for Morgan to have it, don't you think?" "No," I replied, my voice steady. "I don't think that at all." The room fell silent. Iris blinked, and for a moment the polished facade cracked. Callum, she said, softer this time. Think about the family. I have, I answered, locking eyes with her. That's why I'm keeping it. The silence grew heavier, like someone had cut the air out of the room. Morgan's smile disappeared, replaced with something colder. Then in one swift motion, Walter stepped in from the shadows. I hadn't even noticed him standing. His hand moved faster than I could register, grabbing the champagne bottle from the bar. The crash was deafening. Glass shards scattered across the floor, sparkling like stars under the chandelier light. Warmth trickled down my temple, and I touched my hand to it, pulling back to see red. I stumbled back, catching myself on the edge of the bar. Iris didn't move. Morgan didn't move. No one did. They just watched. I straightened up, wiped my hand on my jacket, and looked at them one by one. Thanks for the party, I murmured, voice steady despite the throbbing in my skull. I walked out, leaving a trail of blood droplets in my wake. Not a single person stopped me. Outside, I slid into my car, staring back at the mansion lights flickering in the distance. I pressed my palm to my temple, feeling the wetness seep between my fingers. I turned the ignition, headlights flaring against the night, and pulled away. The party was still going on behind me, but I knew then. I was done being the outsider. The morning sun bled through the blinds of my apartment, slashing thin lines of light across stacks of disheveled paperwork. My head throbbed where the champagne bottle had struck, the bruise blooming across my temple like a violent flower. I winced as I touched it, fingertips coming away slightly sticky. The crimson stain on my collar was stubborn. It hadn't washed out entirely, a ghost of the night before lingering on cotton threads. I settled into my chair, the leather creaking under my weight, and exhaled slowly. In front of me, the dining table was covered in documents. Property deeds, trust agreements, bank statements, all collected over the years like artifacts of a life I was barely holding on to. The condo deed was at the center, its edges worn from handling. I ran my fingers along the embossed lettering, pausing at my own signature. The ink slightly smudged but legible. It didn't feel right. I leaned back, sipping the coffee I brewed hours ago. It was lukewarm bitter, but it kept my hands busy. I shuffled through the papers, highlighting lines, cross-referencing dates. The air grew heavy with the scent of stale caffeine and dust. Midtown bustled beyond my window, oblivious to the unraveling of my life. I picked up the deed again, squinting at the signature. It was mine technically. My name scrolled in hurried cursive, the way I usually signed work documents when rushing between meetings. But there was something off. I flipped to the next page, dated 2 days after my supposed signing, a notary stamp clear and precise, pressed against the corner. It was real, but I didn't remember it. That's when I saw it. The address was wrong. It listed 568 Main Street instead of 5620. It seemed minuscule, a clerical error at best, but something in my gut twisted. I flipped back through the folder, scanning other documents. My finger slid across a crumpled business card near the bottom of the pile, slightly yellowed at the edges. Hudson Raines, corporate law specialist. I hadn't spoken to Hudson since that company dinner 2 years ago. I remembered the cigar smoke swirling in the dim light, his laugh booming across the room. He was old-school Texas. Tailored suits, heavy rings, and a handshake that could crush granite. I tapped the card against the edge of the table, the rhythm syncing with my heartbeat. Finally, I pulled out my phone and dialed. The line clicked and his voice came through gravelly and steady. Hudson Raines speaking. Hudson, it's Callum. Callum Hayes. There was a pause, just long enough for me to imagine him searching through the files in his brain. Well, I'll be damned. Callum Hayes. It's been 2 years closer to 3. What's got you calling me this fine morning? I glanced at the deed sprawled across my desk, its ink glaring up at me. I think I've got a problem. A legal one. Another pause, then a chuckle. Callum, you always did have a knack for trouble. What's going on? I hesitated, fingers brushing against the edge of the silver pocket watch that sat on my desk. I hadn't even realized I'd taken it out of the drawer. Its weight was familiar, grounding. I spun it between my fingers, watching the chain catch the light. I think my condo paperwork was altered. I don't remember signing it. The dates don't match, and there's an address error. Hudson made a low noise in his throat, like the rumble of an engine. That sounds like more than just a typo. You free this afternoon? Come by the office. I'll have a look. Yeah, I'm free. Good. Bring everything you've got. This might be interesting. His voice lingered on the last word, stretching it out like he was savoring it. All right. I'll see you then. We hung up, and the silence in my apartment pressed down hard. I set the phone aside and leaned back in my chair, staring at the piles of paper. It felt like sitting in the middle of a spider's web, thin strands stretching out in every direction, waiting for something to give. I stood up and moved to the kitchen, pouring out the dregs of my coffee and filling the cup again. I could hear the rumble of the city outside, the distant hum of traffic and occasional blare of horns. Midtown was always alive, always pulsing with energy I could never quite tap into. Back at the table, I shuffled the papers into a neater stack, binding them with a rubber band. I picked up the silver pocket watch again, rubbing my thumb over its surface. My father had given it to me on my 30th birthday, back when things still felt like family. Now it was just a reminder of what had been taken. The clock ticked softly in my hand, steady and unyielding. I slipped it back into my coat pocket, grabbing the stack of documents and tucking them under my arm. My reflection caught my eye in the hallway mirror as I passed. Tired eyes, unshaven jaw, and a bruise that had already begun to yellow. I locked the door behind me, double-checking the bolt. There was no telling what they would try next. As I stepped out into the sunlight, the cold morning air bit at my cheeks. I walked to my car, the documents heavy under my arm. Hudson's office was 20 minutes away, and I intended to be early. Sometimes the only way to break a trap is to understand who set it. I slid into the driver's seat, glancing back at the apartment building towering behind me. If there were any eyes watching from the windows, I didn't see them. I started the engine, the hum of the motor drowning out the silence. I adjusted the mirror and caught my own gaze. Steely, determined, not a flicker of doubt. The reflection of Midtown skyline stretched behind me, all glass and ambition. I closed the laptop with a soft click, the screen going black and leaving me with nothing but my own reflection. My hands were steady now, gripping the edge of the table. Whatever game they were playing, I was done sitting out. I was finally ready to play. The smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee hit me the moment I pushed through the glass door of Tommy's Diner. It was like stepping back into the 80s. Red vinyl seats cracked at the seams, a jukebox in the corner that hadn't played a note in years, and a counter lined with chrome bar stools where old regulars sat hunched over their cups. The bell above the door jingled, drawing a glance from Hudson, who was already settled into a booth near the back, fingers drumming rhythmically on the tabletop. He looked exactly the same as I remembered. Gray hair slicked back, thick glasses perched low on his nose, and that same navy suit that seemed to fit him like a second skin. Hudson Raines hadn't aged. He had just solidified, like time couldn't quite touch him. He raised his hand in a half-wave, motioning me over. "Callum Hayes," he greeted, his voice warm and crackling like old radio static. "Been too damn long." I slid into the booth across from him, nodding at the waitress who appeared with a notepad. Hudson flashed her a grin. "Black coffee, 2 sugars." He ordered without hesitation. He turned to me. "The usual for you?" I hesitated. "I haven't been here in years. Some things don't change." He chuckled. "Trust me." The waitress scribbled on her pad and disappeared behind the counter. Hudson leaned back, stretching his arms across the booth. "You know, this is where I met your father," he said, tapping the edge of the table with 2 fingers. "Right here, this very booth." I raised an eyebrow. "My father here?" He nodded, a grin creeping up his face. "Yeah, back in '82. He'd come in every Thursday for pie and black coffee, sat right where you are now." He tapped the table. Again, more firmly this time. Man had a head for numbers like I'd never seen. Could calculate interest rates in his head faster than I could with a calculator. I shifted slightly in my seat, the vinyl creaking beneath me. "I didn't know that." Hudson leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He was a damn good businessman. But you've got his instincts." The waitress returned, setting down 2 steaming mugs. I nodded my thanks, wrapping my hands around the cup. The heat seeped into my palms, grounding me. Hudson sipped his coffee, watching me over the rim. "So," he started, setting the cup down with a soft clink. "You brought the documents?" I nodded, reaching into my briefcase and sliding a manila folder across the table. Hudson's fingers, thin but steady, flipped it open. He thumbed through the pages, pausing occasionally, his eyes scanning the lines with practiced precision. "This," he murmured, tapping one of the documents, "isn't right." He flipped to another page, eyes narrowing. "And this, whoever did this was either sloppy or just plain arrogant." I leaned forward, my palms pressed flat against the table. "What do you mean?" Hudson straightened, adjusting his glasses. "This deed transfer," he began, tapping the page again. "It's dated 2 weeks after your supposed signature. And look here, there's a notary stamp that's out of sequence. That alone could void this." I blinked, absorbing the information. "You're saying it's fake?" "I'm saying it's shaky. Very shaky." He flipped to another page, this one detailing the Midtown condo. "But this is the real kicker." He slid the page toward me. "See the address?" I nodded. 568 Main Street. Hudson chuckled, shaking his head. "That's not your property, Callum. Your condo is at 5620 Main Street. This transfer document, it's a phantom. Doesn't exist." My hands gripped the edge of the table. "So what does that mean?" Hudson leaned back, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "It means you've got leverage. A lot of it." I exhaled, a knot uncoiling in my stomach. For the first time in days, something felt right. "And the house?" "Highland Village." Hudson raised an eyebrow, a sly grin spreading across his face. He pulled out another document from the folder, this one printed on thick, cream-colored paper. The header read, "Hayes Family Trust Agreement, 1987. "This is where it gets interesting," Hudson said, tapping the header with one long finger. "The Highland Village Mansion, It was never legally transferred. Your fathers will allocated it to you, but they never filed the deed correctly. They've been living in that house under assumed ownership. I stared at him unblinking. You're telling me I own it? Hudson nodded. Every square foot. They've been squatting on your property for years. You're the legal owner. The words sunk in like stones in still water, rippling out slowly. I took a long breath trying to process it. The house. The one they lorded over me at every holiday, every family dinner, the symbol of their status. It was mine. My hand drifted to the inside pocket of my jacket, fingers brushing against the cool surface of the silver pocket watch. I pulled it out, setting it gently on the table. The chain coiled neatly beside it, the metal catching the diner's fluorescent light. Hudson's eyes flickered to it, a smile playing on his lips. That's your father's watch, isn't it? He asked. I nodded. He gave it to me on my 30th birthday. Hudson grinned, tapping the watch with his knuckle. Fitting. A reminder of what's yours. I glanced at the watch, the minute hand ticking away with steady resolve. My grip tightened around the coffee cup, the ceramic warm and solid in my hand. I looked up at Hudson, my jaw set. What do we do next? His grin widened. First we take back what's yours. And then, he leaned forward, eyes glinting with anticipation, we make sure they know it. I didn't flinch. For the first time I felt a stirring of something dangerous, something that tasted a lot like power. The heavy wooden doors of the Highland Village mansion groaned as they swung open, revealing the grand foyer lined with polished oak and sweeping chandeliers. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug stretching across the marble floor. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish and old money. It was immaculate, too immaculate. Everything in its place, every surface gleaming. It felt staged, like the set of a play where I was meant to be the unwilling actor. Iris appeared from the side hall, her heels clicking with precision. She wore a pearl-gray dress, its fabric shimmering under the chandelier light. Her smile was polished, lips painted in a shade too bold for her age. Callum, she greeted, stretching out her arms like she was welcoming a long-lost son. I did not step forward to meet her embrace. Iris, I replied, nodding curtly. Her smile faltered just for a moment before she regained composure. Come, everyone is waiting. She gestured down the hall where heavy double doors loomed like the entrance to a vault. I followed her, my hands slipping into the pockets of my coat. My fingers found the cool surface of the silver pocket watch, and I rolled it between my fingers. Its weight was grounding steady. We walked in silence, the only sound the faint echo of our steps. Inside the room they were waiting, Morgan, Vivian, and Walter. Morgan stood by the window, his posture stiff, hands clasped behind his back, as if he were overseeing his kingdom. Vivian sat primly on a velvet chair, her legs crossed, hands resting delicately in her lap. Walter was by the fireplace, his gaze distant, fingers tapping rhythmically against the mantel. Callum, Morgan acknowledged, turning to face me. His voice was smooth, too smooth. Good to see you. Likewise. Iris moved past me, taking her seat at the head of the long mahogany table. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. Please sit. I hesitated just long enough for her smile to tighten before I lowered myself into the chair, setting my briefcase beside me. I didn't bother removing my coat. Well, she began, folding her hands in front of her. We appreciate you coming. We just have a few formalities to get through. Her smile sharpened. I raised an eyebrow. Formalities? Yes, she purred, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. We've prepared everything for you. Just a few signatures. I reached for the envelope, letting my fingers brush its edge before I slid it back to her side of the table. I don't think so. Her smile wavered. Excuse me. I won't be signing anything today. The room went still. Morgan's hands clenched behind his back, and Vivian's fingers twitched slightly in her lap. Walter's gaze remained fixed on the fire, as if the flames held answers he wasn't willing to share. I leaned back, crossing my legs. I brought something for you, I said calmly, lifting the briefcase onto the table. The locks clicked as I popped it open, sliding out a crisp folder with Hudson's insignia stamped on the front. I placed it directly in front of Iris. Her fingers hovered over the folder, eyes flicking back to me. What is this? That, I said, leaning back into the chair, is the legal ownership of Highland Village. According to the Hayes Family Trust Agreement of 1987, the mansion belongs to me. Iris blinked, her hand recoiling slightly. That's impossible. I shrugged, tapping the folder. You can check the signatures, the notary stamps, all of it. It's perfectly legal. In fact, it's been legal for the last 30 years. You've just been borrowing it. Morgan stepped forward, his face reddening. What kind of game are you playing, Callum? I didn't even look at him. My eyes stayed fixed on Iris, watching as she flipped through the documents, her hands shaking just slightly. This is absurd, she whispered, voice cracking just enough to be noticeable. It's legal, I corrected. And it's mine. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging in perfect, unyielding rhythm. Then without warning, Iris's hand shot out, knocking over her wine glass. It shattered against the floor, crimson liquid spilling out like blood creeping across the polished oak. Vivian gasped, hands coming to her mouth, and Morgan stepped back, his shoes narrowly avoiding the spreading stain. Walter finally looked away from the fire, his eyes settling on me with something close to recognition, or maybe it was fear. Iris stood, her palms flat against the table. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything?" Her voice was shrill now, the mask slipping. "I'm not taking anything," I replied evenly, standing up and smoothing the front of my coat. "I'm just reclaiming what's mine." I reached for the briefcase, snapping it shut and tucking the folder back inside. I could feel their eyes burning into my back as I turned towards the door. "I'll have the legal team contact you about the details. I'm sure it will be cordial." Morgan's fists clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. Vivian's eyes shimmered with disbelief, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Walter simply watched, his gaze heavy and unblinking. I paused at the doorway, turning back one last time. "Oh, and Iris?" She stiffened, her fingers still trembling against the polished wood of the table. I smiled. "It's just business." Her eyes flashed with rage, and before she could respond, I stepped out into the hallway, my footsteps steady and unhurried. The winter wind sliced through me as I stepped outside, but I didn't flinch. I pulled the collar of my coat up against the cold, slipping my hand into the pocket where the silver pocket watch rested. I could feel its weight, it sticking steady against my palm. The doors closed behind me, the echo carrying through the courtyard. I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I had walked out of that house without feeling the weight of its walls pressing down on me, and I intended to keep it that way. Hudson's office smelled of old leather and fresh ink, the kind of place where power was brokered behind closed doors, far away from the prying eyes of the public. Shelves lined with thick, leather-bound books stretched from floor to ceiling, their spines marked with cases dating back decades. A massive wooden desk dominated the center of the room, its surface cluttered with manila folders, legal briefs, and an ornate brass pen holder that looked like it hadn't been moved in years. I stepped inside, closing the heavy door behind me. Hudson glanced up from his chair, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "Callum," he greeted, rising to shake my hand. His grip was firm, grounding. "Good to see you." I took the seat opposite him, the leather groaning slightly under my weight. Hudson wasted no time. He reached for a thick envelope sitting at the corner of his desk and slid it across the polished wood. "This," he began, tapping the envelope with his index finger, "will be delivered by noon." I picked it up, feeling the weight of it. "What is it?" "Eviction notices," Hudson replied, his voice steady, "legally binding and ready to execute." A grin crept onto my lips, unbidden. I didn't think it would move this quickly. Hudson leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "The law is funny that way. When you have the right leverage, it's almost efficient." He nodded toward the window behind him, where the Houston skyline sprawled beneath thickening gray clouds. "You know, I once watched your father broker a deal from this very chair. He took a man's entire real estate portfolio with just 2 signatures." I raised an eyebrow. "2?" Hudson nodded, his eyes gleaming with nostalgia. "The first was his. The second was the man's. Took him 2 hours to realize what he'd signed away." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." He slid another folder across the desk. This one was thicker, the pages inside bulging against the manila cover. "This," he said, tapping it gently, "is our ticket to making sure they can't fight back." I opened the folder, skimming the first few pages. Financial statements, property tax slips, transfer agreements. Hayes Capital Holdings lay bare in legal terminology. "These are evidence. They've been siphoning off funds into private accounts," Hudson confirmed. "I've traced it back 6 years. Quiet little movements, 10,000 here, 50,000 there. Adds up." I flipped through the pages, the enormity of it sinking in. "This is enough to bury them." Hudson smiled, a gleam of satisfaction dancing in his eyes. "More than enough. I've already spoken to a few people downtown. Once this goes public, the mansion is just the beginning." I leaned back in my chair, letting the reality of it settle. "So what happens next?" Hudson adjusted his glasses. "Next we file for rightful ownership. We serve those notices. And then we wait." "Wait for what?" He smirked. "For them to crack." I closed the folder, setting it back on the desk. "And if they don't?" "They will," Hudson replied without hesitation. "They always do." The clock on the wall ticked softly, its rhythm steady and unyielding. I reached into my coat pocket, fingers brushing against the familiar weight of the silver pocket watch. I pulled it out, its surface cool and polished, the hand still ticking with stubborn persistence. Hudson glanced at it and smiled. "Still have that old thing?" "Still works," I replied, snapping it shut and slipping it back into my pocket. Hudson nodded approvingly. "Some things are built to last." There was a knock at the door, and Hudson's secretary stepped in, her heels tapping softly against the hardwood. "Mr. Raines, the courier is here for the documents." Hudson straightened, nodding toward me. Would you like to do the honors? I didn't hesitate. I stood, picking up the thick envelope, its weight solid in my hands. I handed it over to the courier, a young man in a crisp suit who barely looked old enough to drink. He accepted it with both hands, nodding respectfully. I'll have it delivered by noon, sir. See that you do, Hudson replied. The door clicked shut behind him, and Hudson turned back to me. Now, he said, settling back into his chair, we wait for the fireworks. By 3 they had begun. I watched it unfold from my apartment window, sipping black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. My view of the city stretched out in all directions, gray buildings rising like jagged teeth against the sky, heavy with rain. On the flat-screen television mounted to the wall, Morgan and Walter stood before a wall of reporters, microphones thrust towards them like spears. Morgan was speaking, his voice muffled through the glass and distance, but the scroll at the bottom of the screen told the story well enough. Hayes Capital Holdings faces legal challenge. Family dispute over property and trust funds. I raised the mug to my lips, the coffee still warm. On the screen, Morgan's face twisted with what might have been concern, or maybe fear. Walter stood behind him, hands folded neatly across his chest, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the cameras. I could almost hear their voices, the rehearsed lines and careful gestures. This is a misunderstanding, Morgan would say. A family matter, nothing more. But the journalists were relentless, microphones bobbing forward, questions sharp and unyielding. I took another sip, watching them deflect, stall, spin. The mansion in Highland Village loomed behind them, its windows gleaming under the pressed lights. My house. I placed the mug down, turning back to the documents sprawled across my desk. The eviction notices were clean, pristine, Hudson's penmanship scrolled neatly across the bottom, his signature bold and unflinching. My name beside it, sharp and definitive. I reached for the silver pocket watch, setting it on the desk. It clicked softly, each second a reminder that time was no longer on their side. The rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. It blurred the cityscape through my window, smearing lights and shadows into streaks of gray. I watched Morgan and Walter retreat from the cameras, their faces frozen in polite smiles that I knew were already cracking beneath the surface. The coffee steamed beside me, a thin wisp of warmth against the chill that had settled in the room. I leaned back, folding my hands behind my head, eyes fixed on the rain-splattered glass. Now the real game begins, I murmured, the words slipping out before I could catch them, and somehow I knew they were true. Screens glowed in the dim light of my apartment, their reflections stretching long across the hardwood floors. Rain pattered steadily against the window pane, blurring the Houston skyline into streaks of gray and white. The news anchors spoke in hurried tones, their voices overlapping as headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Hayes Capital Holdings under federal investigation. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly. My laptop sat open on the desk, a new email from Hudson blinking impatiently in my inbox. Clicked it open. Subject: the cracking column. It's only a matter of time. I hope you're ready for this. Hudson. I read it twice, the corners of my mouth twitching into something close to a smile. Hudson didn't need to say more. The television was doing all the talking. Newscasters dissected every financial record that had been leaked, evidence of funds being funneled into private accounts, hidden beneath shell corporations and offshore trusts. Walter's name was splashed across the headlines alongside Morgan's, the two of them frozen in unflattering snapshots as they left the Hayes Capital offices with stone-set faces. The rain outside intensified, streaking down the windows in jagged lines. I reached over, running my fingers along the edge of the silver pocket watch that sat on my desk. Its ticking was barely audible over the sound of raindrops, but it was there, steady, unyielding. I flipped it open, watching the hands move in perfect synchronization. Time, it seemed, was finally on my side. My phone buzzed against the table, vibrating insistently. I glanced at the screen. Vivian. Her name glowed with a desperation I could almost feel. I let it ring out, watching as it went silent, only to light up again a moment later. She was persistent, I'd give her that, but I had nothing to say. I turned back to the screen, clicking through Hudson's attachments. Legal briefs, financial summaries, printouts of account transfers, all with his neat, methodical notes scrolled in the margins. He was building a case so airtight, not even Morgan's smooth lawyers would be able to poke a hole through it. My eyes flickered back to the television just in time to catch Morgan stepping up to a podium. His face was pale, eyes sunken with fatigue, but he forced a smile as the cameras clicked. Behind him stood Walter, hands clasped. Morgan cleared his throat, the microphone amplifying the sound to a grating echo. I want to address the allegations that have been brought forth against Hayes Capital Holdings, he began, his voice steady but strained. These claims are baseless, the result of mismanagement and miscommunication. We are fully cooperating with federal investigators, and I assure you, the truth will come out. I laughed, a short, sharp sound that startled me in the quiet of my apartment. He still thought he could charm his way out of this. The news anchor came back on screen, dissecting Morgan's speech with thinly veiled skepticism. Her voice faded as I clicked over to my email, drafting a statement of my own. Media statement. Hayes Capital Holdings. To whom it may concern. As the rightful owner of Highland Village and a principal heir to Hayes Capital Holdings, I stand firmly in support of the federal investigation. For years, I watched as financial discrepancies were swept under the rug, hidden behind facades of charity and community engagement. The truth is finally coming to light, and I intend to see it through. Transparency is not just a demand, it's a right. Sincerely, Callum Hayes. I read it twice, then hit send. The cursor blinked at me, steady and unyielding. Outside, the rain continued its relentless drumbeat, tapping against the glass in rhythm with the pocket watch on my desk. I stood, stretching out the stiffness in my shoulders, and walked to the window. Houston stretched out before me, slick with rain and shadowed in the encroaching dusk. Red and white lights blurred through the mist, headlights flashing as cars moved in unison along the freeway. I watched them for a long moment, the silence broken only by the hum of my laptop as it sent email after email to Hudson and the media contacts he had prepared. 2 days later it happened. I was back in Hudson's office, the rain still steady outside his windows. He sat behind his desk, sleeves rolled up and glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. He looked up as I entered, waving me over to the screen on his desk. You're going to want to see this. I leaned over his shoulder, eyes squinting at the grainy footage. Federal agents dressed in black suits and carrying steel briefcases were lining up outside the glass doors of Hayes Capital Holdings. They moved with precision, tapping on the glass and waiting for the guards to unlock the entrance. Hudson grinned, his teeth flashing white. 3 separate warrants. They're seizing everything. I watched as the doors were unlatched, agents flooding the lobby with the kind of efficiency you only see in government takedowns. Papers were handed over, signatures scribbled. A woman in a tight blazer gestured wildly, her face a mask of disbelief. I didn't recognize her, but I imagined she knew exactly what was coming. They're shutting it down? I asked, voice low. Hudson nodded, tapping the edge of the screen. Effective immediately. Morgan and Walter are barred from entering the premises until further notice. Any assets linked to the siphon funds are frozen. It's over. I straightened, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My gaze drifted to the rain streaking the window, beads of water racing each other to the sill. You did it, Hudson said, leaning back in his chair. The whole empire. It's falling. I met his eyes, the grin stretching across my face before I could stop it. No, I corrected. We did it. He laughed, the sound echoing off the walls of his office. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the silver pocket watch and setting it on his desk. Its hands ticked steadily, unbothered by the chaos unfolding across the city. I closed my laptop, its screen flickering to black. I stood by the window, watching the rain wash away the grime of the city, my reflection faint and sharp against the glass. I touched the cool surface with my fingertips, leaving faint smudges behind. One more step, I whispered, the words fogging up the pain. Just one more. I turned back to Hudson, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a well-played hand. He raised his coffee cup in a silent toast, and I returned the gesture, knowing the real battle was just beginning. The mansion stood empty, its gates creaking under the weight of the wind. I pushed them open, the iron hinges groaning like an old man rising from his chair. Rust flaked off in delicate curls, drifting to the cracked stone path beneath my feet. The gardens that once bloomed with hydrangeas and lilies were overgrown now, tangled with ivy and dandelions. Weeds sprouted defiantly through the cobblestones, reaching for sunlight that streamed through clouds still heavy with morning mist. Hudson pulled up behind me in his old Buick, the engine sputtering before he killed it. He stepped out, his coat flapping in the breeze, and made his way over, a large iron key dangling from his fingertips. He handed it to me with a grin. It's all yours, Callum. I turned the key over in my hand, its weight surprising. I glanced up at the house, the shell of a house, and let out a long breath. It's been empty for a year, Hudson added, hands tucked into his pockets. They cleared out fast once the feds got involved. Probably didn't want to leave a trail. I nodded, slipping the key into my coat pocket. Let's make something out of it. Hudson's grin widened, and he clapped me on the back. That's the spirit. The contractors arrived at noon, their trucks kicking up clouds of dust as they parked along the curb. Men in overalls hauled out toolboxes, ladders, and sheets of plywood, all while Hudson barked orders like a foreman. I stood back, watching the procession with my hands in my pockets, feeling the wind tug at my sleeves. The front door swung open for the first time in over a year, revealing a grand foyer draped in dust. Chandeliers hung above like relics of a forgotten age, their crystals clouded and dulled. I walked through slowly, my footsteps echoing against marble floors that once gleamed beneath designer heels and polished leather shoes. The silence was thick, almost reverent, like the walls were holding their breath. Quite a place, a voice said from behind me. I turned to find Hudson standing in the doorway, his hands resting on his hips. You sure you want to do this? He asked, his eyes scanning the room. It's going to take a hell of a lot of work. I nodded, brushing dust off a banister. It's time it became something good. We walked through the halls together, Hudson taking notes and snapping pictures on his phone. The contractors followed behind, stripping away old drapes and prying up floorboards that had warped with age. Dust hung in the sunlight that poured through cracked windows, swirling like ghosts of the past. As we reached the west wing, I paused. A patch of sunlight caught the edge of something silver, gleaming softly beneath a pile of discarded tarps. I stepped forward, nudging the debris aside with my foot. A silver pocket watch, its surface scratched but unmistakable, lay there like it had been waiting for me. I bent down and picked it up, brushing off the dust. It clicked softly in my hand, the minute hand ticking away in perfect rhythm. Hudson watched me from the doorway, his brow raised. "Well, would you look at that?" "An heirloom," I replied quietly, slipping it into my pocket. "Guess it found its way back." Hudson smiled. "Maybe it's a sign." By the end of the week, the place was unrecognizable. Walls had been stripped bare. Floors sanded down to their original grain. Volunteers from the community trickled in, many of them faces I vaguely recognized from the neighborhood. People who had once nodded politely at garden parties or glanced away during awkward encounters at the grocery store. Now they wore work gloves and bandanas, sweat streaking their brows as they lifted boxes and tore up carpeting. There was a sense of unity in the chaos. Laughter mixed with the grind of power tools, and every nail hammered into place felt like it was erasing a fragment of the mansion's past. The grand dining hall where Morgan had once toasted his victories was gutted and repurposed as a communal meeting space. The study where Walter had counted his ill-gotten gains now stood as the foundation for a library and learning center. One afternoon, as we were clearing out the remnants of the east wing, a woman approached me, holding something small and gleaming in her hand. Her hair was white, tied back with a scarf, and her eyes were bright with recognition. She stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "You don't know me, but I knew your father." I blinked, taking a step closer. "You did." She nodded, extending her hand. Resting on her palm was another silver pocket watch, identical to the one I'd found. "He gave this to me," she said quietly, "back in 1985 when I worked as his secretary. He always said it was a reminder that time could be borrowed, but never kept." My breath caught. I took the watch from her hand, the metal cool against my palm. "Thank you," I whispered. She smiled, her eyes glimmering with unshed tears. "I'm glad you're doing this," she said, gesturing to the gutted mansion. "He would have been proud." I nodded, too choked up to respond. She left shortly after, her footsteps soft against the polished marble. I watched her go, the watch still heavy in my hand. By the end of the month, the first signboard went up, its letters freshly painted and bold against the morning sky. The crowd that had gathered to watch broke into applause, a ripple of excitement that spread through the courtyard. I stood back, hands in my pockets, watching the letters glint under the sunlight. Hudson joined me, arms crossed over his chest, a grin stretching wide across his face. "You did it," he said, nodding at the sign. "No," I corrected, feeling the weight of the silver pocket watch against my chest. "We did it." Hudson laughed, clapping me on the back. "I suppose that's true." The wind rustled through the empty halls, whispering through the broken window panes. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to it carry the dust of old memories away. I opened my eyes, taking in the transformation. The stripped floors, the boarded-up windows soon to be replaced, the volunteers hammering away with smiles on their faces. "This is just the beginning," I murmured, my voice nearly lost to the wind. Hudson looked at me, his smile fading into something softer, more reflective. "I'd say it's a damn good start." And for the first time in a long time I believed him. A ribbon stretched across the entrance of the Highland Community Trust, fluttering gently in the morning breeze. Sunlight spilled over the freshly painted facade, its reflection gleaming off the new glass windows. The once abandoned mansion now stood tall, vibrant, and full of life. The gardens had been replanted with blooming azaleas and lavender, their scents mingling with the aroma of freshly cut grass. Laughter and chatter drifted from the crowd that had gathered. Outside, neighbors and friends standing shoulder to shoulder, faces bright with anticipation. Hudson stood beside me, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. He wore a tailored gray suit, the fabric pressed and pristine. He nudged me gently with his elbow, a grin spreading across his face. "You've come a long way, Callum." I glanced over at him, unable to stop the smile that tugged at my own lips. "I had good company," I replied, my hand brushing the cool metal of the silver pocket watch nestled in my jacket. Its weight was familiar now, almost comforting. The crowd quieted as Hudson stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily over the courtyard, "thank you all for coming today. What you see here is not just the revival of an old building. It's the rebirth of a community." Applause erupted, and I watched as familiar faces beamed back at us. People I'd known since childhood, old neighbors, friends of my father, new families that had moved in during the years I'd spent away. They were all here, standing in unity, anticipation crackling in the air. Hudson turned back to me, his eyes shining with pride. "Callum," he said, extending the oversized silver scissors toward me. "I believe you have the honors." I stepped forward, the crowd parting slightly to make room. I took the scissors from Hudson's hands, the blades cool and heavy. The ribbon fluttered softly, its ends held by two local children, their eyes wide with excitement. I bent down to their level, smiling. Ready. They nodded enthusiastically, and I straightened, positioning the scissors around the taut fabric. I hesitated for just a moment, taking in the faces watching, the building standing strong behind me, the weight of everything that had brought us here. I closed the blades with a satisfying snip. The crowd erupted into applause, cheers ringing out as the ribbon fell to the ground. Camera flashes popped, and I blinked against the sudden burst of light. Hudson patted me on the back, his hand firm and reassuring. "You did good, Callum," he said softly. I turned back to the building, the doors swinging open as the first wave of families stepped inside. Mothers with children in tow, elderly couples leaning on canes, teenagers with backpacks slung over their shoulders. They moved through the lobby, their footsteps echoing off polished wood floors, their voices mingling with laughter that filled the space where silence had once suffocated. I walked slowly through the halls, my shoes tapping softly against the floors. The walls were freshly painted, adorned with photographs of Houston's history, community picnics, church gatherings, family reunions. I paused outside the wing that had once been my father's study. The heavy oak doors had been replaced with glass, the room beyond transformed into a library, shelves stacked with books donated by local families. At the entrance, a bronze plaque caught my eye. The letters were engraved in sharp, bold strokes. Walter Hayes Memorial Wing. Honoring the past, building the future. I stepped closer, running my fingers over the metal. It was smooth and cool to the touch. I stood there for a moment, my mind quiet. I didn't feel anger, not anymore. Just resolution. The main hall bustled with life. Children chased each other through the corridors, their laughter ricocheting off the walls. Volunteers handed out food packages and supplies, setting up tables for job training workshops and after-school programs. The kitchen was alive with the smell of fresh bread and simmering soup, a line already forming outside. I made my way to the main entrance, where a glass display case had been mounted beside the doors. Inside, polished and restored to its original sheen, lay the silver pocket watch. Its hands ticked steadily, reflecting the sunlight that streamed through the glass. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "A new beginning, in memory of what was and what will be." I stared at it for a long moment, the world moving around me, yet everything felt still. Hudson stepped up beside me, nodding approvingly. "Looks good in there," he said. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It does." We stood in silence, watching families filter in and out of the doors, their faces lit with hope and possibility. I could hear the faint strains of music from somewhere in the building, something soft and melodic. I closed my eyes just for a moment, letting the sounds wash over me. Hudson clapped his hands together, shaking me from my thoughts. "Well," he said, "I'd say we did a damn good job." I smiled, stepping back onto the front steps, the wind catching my coat and billowing it gently behind me. I looked out across the courtyard, now filled with people, real people whose lives would be better because of this place. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything lift off my shoulders. "We finally did it," I murmured, more to myself than anyone else. But Hudson heard. "He always did," he nodded, a grin splitting his face. "Yes, Callum, you did." I stepped forward, the sunlight warm on my face, the hum of life filling my ears. The doors of the Highland Community Trust swung open behind me, voices spilling out like music. I paused, my hand brushing against the silver pocket watch, still ticking faithfully in its case. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I was walking toward it. And I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The sun dipped low over the Highland Community Trust, casting long shadows across the freshly painted walls and flower beds that now thrived where weeds once grew. I stood by the glass case where a silver pocket watch gleamed, its surface polished and pristine, ticking steadily as if keeping time for a brighter future. It had come full circle just like I had. Sometimes the things we think are lost forever come back stronger, but only if we have the courage to rebuild them. Not all families are made of blood. Some are built from shared dreams and second chances. Maybe redemption isn't about erasing the past, but rewriting it, one act of kindness at a time.